historians should never say miracle because we'll lose our jobs if everything's a miracle. That's not good. But Australia is key to this, right?
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. One of the most significant achievements of the Menzies government was its signing of a commerce agreement with Japan in 1957, just 12 years after the end of World War II. This marked the beginning of Australia's pivot to Asia and the birth of one of Australia's most successful economic and strategic relationships. But the commerce agreement was controversial. Many in Menzies' cabinet had fought the Japanese in the war, while several MPs were Japanese POWs. Thousands protested in the streets against the commerce agreement, and firebrand Labor MP Eddie Waugh said it was a criminal action against the Australian nation. Now, Menzies' counterpart in all this was Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke, a wartime technocrat turned architect of Japan's post-war centre-right politics. Kishi's role in shaping post-war Japan, its economic revival and domestic politics is significant. Joining me today to discuss Kishi is lecturer in modern Japanese history at the Australian National University, Andrew Levidis. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Andrew.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on, and it's a subject I have a personal fascination in for a number of reasons. Obviously, I was a diplomat in Japan and focused on Japanese domestic politics, but my grandfather was one of those Japanese POWs who then became a member of the Menzies cabinet as immigration minister during this time of the signing of the commerce agreement. So we have sort of personal family reflections on this, as well as just an appreciation for what this did, not just to Australia, but of course for Japan's economic development in the post-war period. So, Andrew, tell me about Japan's politics and democracy or not prior to World War II to sort of set the scene of where we come from.
Yeah. So in terms of Kishi, I'll sort of, focus on that point and how he sort of came up through that era. And so sort of like trying to shape the era, but through the perspectives of, one life, one single life. So Kishi was born basically at the close of the 19th century. And, his first memories of this period was of that he writes about in his memoirs and other, reflections on youth, came around the time of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905. And to him, it was such like a pivotal moment. He spoke about, a kind of delirium and passion for victory that fell upon the people when they heard of Japan's striking victories in land and sea. Kishi, from an early age, he was born in Yamaguchi Prefecture, which is one of the bastions of the Meiji Restoration. And so he carried with him a kind of sense of the past, a role that he was being born into. But, he came from a pretty middle-ranking family. What made him stand out at that time was his educational successes. He was at one of the prestigious middle schools in Yamaguchi before moving on to the first high school in Tokyo. And the first high school is equivalent to something like Eton in the UK or Groton, in the United States. The role it served as an incubator of kind of an elite to rule the state. He graduated first in his class, so it's significant. It's very significant. And that period was, his time at the first high school was sort of intersected with the First World War, and it was a kind of sense that at the end of that war, there was a new era of renovation and reform upon the world, the Bolshevik Revolution, the fall of the monarchies in Europe, kind of new breath of Wilsonianism, Japan's increased globalizing role in the world. And at the same time, there was like darkening shadows over that period, the increase of liberal ideas was not entirely accepted by many, And Kishi entered into Tokyo Imperial University, the forerunner of the University of Tokyo. And he ran in a time where the ideas of democracy, liberalism were, in flourishing, but also Marxism after the Bolshevik Revolution. And he sort of turned away from those ideas. He was attracted, but he had a lot of ambivalent thoughts about it. So he came under the mentorship of Professor Uesugi Shinkichi, a kind of constitutional lawyer, a constitutional scholar there. And he fell into a kind of, student activism on the conservative and nationalist side. And they were involved in some spectacular instances of attacks on academic freedom and, student sort of politics at that time. He graduated also near the top of his class. It can sort of tell you that he was one of the elite, groomed to be, one of a key bureaucrat. But instead of joining one of the top-line ministries, the Home Ministry or the Finance Ministry, he opted to join the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And it was a strange choice, right? Because at that time, Japan's economy is undergoing these vast transformations, concentration, rationalization of the economy. So Kishi moved into this area where he thought he would be able to stand at the kind of vanguard of the future, sort of reforming the economy, rethinking the relationship of the state and capitalism and other things throughout the 1920s. During that period, he rose rapidly through the ranks. But the real changes came after 1929 and the world crisis in capitalism, the Great Depression. After that, his ideas of controlling capitalism, bringing about control of industry, taming sort of untrammeled capitalism and having the capitalism work for the state. Those were the ideas which catapulted him into kind of national prominence. So in around 1931, he was a key architect of the Major Industries Control Law. And that was an attempt to bring industry more under state guidance and tame, the excesses of what they saw as capitalism, the overproduction, competition, and rationalize industry in that. At this time, Japan's entering a moment of tumult. 1931, we have the Manchurian incident where the Kwantung Army, launches a kind of preemptive effort to bring the northeast provinces of China under, more securely under Japanese control. Because Manchuria was an area of extensive Japanese interest, a railroad empire known as the South Manchurian Railway. It was also a center of extensive Japanese interests and rights in China. And there was a growing fear by the Kwantung Army at that time that if Japan doesn't act now, the surge of nationalism in China, plus, the rise of Soviet power in the Far East would, endanger Japanese interests. For Kishi, it was a turning point. He started to become more involved at that period with a group of people within the bureaucracy called reform bureaucrats or renovationist bureaucrats. In Japanese, it's kakushin kanryo. These were kind of bureaucrats who in their youth had read Marx. They had read, widely in terms of German historical school and other ideas of rationalism, Fordism and that. And they saw themselves as standing on the precipice of the future direction of the economy, of the political economy. So during this time, Kishi becomes one of the self-acknowledged leaders of this movement. And their aim is not simply the transformation or renovation of the economy and controlling the economy for, a transcendental purpose of national development and national wealth and power. But they were envisioning sweeping reforms of Japan's politics. At that time, Japan had been ruled by party governments for 7-8 years, basically, on and off. But it had been a really tumultuous period. Cabinets were formed before they fell within months. There was a rotating thing. Policy, long-term policy was no longer possible. And the parties themselves were internally riven. And so Kishi watched the collapse of the parties, and it had a profound impact upon his view of politics, right? The question was, if the parties no longer have the ability to formulate long-term policy and stable governance, and they can no longer meet, the exigencies of international crisis, whether in Manchuria or the crisis of capitalism or Japan's position in the world vis-a-vis the Anglo-American powers, then the question was, what would be the options? And Kishi turned to, non-democratic forms of what he saw as a better option. So first was an idea of national unity governments where politics would be separated out from the parties. Government would be led by, so-called non-partisan technocrats under former retired government officials or former admirals, or generals and that. It was an attempt to form national unity while the parties were able to recover their cohesion and maybe restore their role as key institutions in the Japanese political system. But they didn't, right? And the parties never regained control. They continued to have, a really powerful role within the Japanese politics. But from 1932, I think, until 1945, the end of the war, there was never a party government.
Tell me, Andrew, was there a sense that private enterprise should play a role, but it would need to be directed by the state, or was Kishi more in favour of nationalised industries and the state actually controlling everything?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a really strange term the Japanese use to talk about people like Kishi. They say the word in Japanese is koka shakai shugi, which basically a bad translation could be state socialists, right? They believe that private enterprise should remain, but it should be controlled. and that profits and all this should be directed towards, an overarching development of, national power and wealth. In 1940, Kishi, when he was Vice Minister of Commerce under the Prince Konoe government, this was a period of the New Order movement, an attempt to reform Japan's politics and economy comprehensively. Then Kishi was an architect of a kind of policy which went a lot further. And this was talking about the separation of management and ownership and, management and workers. And they were talking basically about the reform of capitalism itself. So they were willing to go much, much further by the end of the 1930s. So I think one of the key moments between that and his earlier, more general idea of rationalizing and control of the political economy occurs around 1936 when he decides to go to Manchuria, and he serves as like the architect of the Manchurian 5-year plans. So by this time, Manchuria had become, the Japanese had founded a new state in Manchuria under the former Qing Emperor of China. And it was a really interesting decision, right? So after World War I, the whole thrust of international politics was the end of monarchy, the fall of, the Hohenzollern, the Habsburgs, the Romanov dynasty. And here Japan is a decade after the Versailles Treaty, erecting a state based on monarchical sort of principles. And so Kishi turns up at this, putative Manchurian empire, which had by 1936 become a kind of experimental state where the most elite members of the Japanese bureaucracy were sent to Manchuria to build up a new state. And there they had free range, right? Where in Japan they were limited by, party interests, business, other sort of power. In Manchuria, they were under the guidance of the Kwangtung Army, the military governors of Manchuria. They had a free rein to experiment with entirely a new vision of political economy. Manchuria's great statement was at that time, hostility to monopoly capitalism. And, so they were hostile to sort of capital. And this was a place where Kishi's ideas, developed a kind of new direction and a new momentum. In Manchuria, he started working on ideas of total war economic development, and throughout Manchuria in the northeast, you can see, Japanese built new cities, the fastest train network, the largest dams in the world at the time, on the, Manchurian and Korean border, and vast, enterprises, the Fushun Colliery, these huge, industrial projects, monuments to this total war development. And Kishi was the architect of all that policy. And he was the architect of what became known as the Manchurian 5-year plan, which was modeled after the Soviet 5-year plans and German National Socialist plans. And this was an attempt to militarize the economy where the economic power and, kind of a military-led direction came together, or some military-led development. And so from 1936 through to 1940, Kishi was the architect of the transformation of Manchuria. And it had a profound influence upon his thought, not simply in terms of the economy, but it opened his eyes to, he became one of the key civilian leaders of this state. As he departed Manchuria in 1939, he said the state was the greatest achievement he'd ever done. And the 3 years there had a pivotal role in shaping the course of his life and his vision, not just of politics, but of economics. He had a really deep belief in a kind of Pan-Asian ideals, or the idealism of that at the time. And I think that is one thing that stuck with him in various forms throughout much of his life.
Andrew, what was the ultimate aspiration in the 30s for Japan? Was it to territorially expand throughout Asia, to sort of be the Pan-Asia empire, or was it its economic development, but of course in the service of the state, not of individual business owners and owners of capital?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. At the end of the First World War, Japan is one of the key allied powers, one of the major allied powers. At the Paris Peace Treaty, they're one of the founding members of the League of Nations. Around 1922, they become signatories to the Washington Treaty System, which replaced the imperial treaties like the Anglo-Japanese Alliance with a more broad-based but ultimately sort of elusive system of arms limitations, open economic trade, and cooperative imperialism, basically, between the great powers. So Japan based itself throughout the 1920s on this system, the Washington system, which would hopefully ensure cooperative imperialism in terms of protecting their interests in China. The problem is the Washington system was based on a kind of a China which was disintegrating in terms of politics in the 1920s. And during that time, we have the rise of the nationalists in South China, under Sun Yat-sen, then later under Chiang Kai-shek, which promote a kind of revolutionary diplomacy. So by the end of the 1930s, the political base upon which the Washington system was based, started to break down in China. And the other powers were unwilling to act in concert with Japan to defend Japan's imperial rights and interests on the continent, which had been won in previous wars and in other sort of agreements with China since the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So by the end of the 1930s, large segments of the Japanese elite had come to believe, had come to lose faith in the Washington system as a way to maintain their rights and interests on the continent. And they worried about the long-term consequences of the rise of nationalist revolutionary diplomacy within China, and at the same time, the reinforcement and growth of power of the Soviet Union, the Red Army.
So it was sort of a defensive approach then. They were worried about instability in China and what that might do to Japanese interests, and therefore the solution was to grow the Japanese empire and economic might.
Economics, yeah. So by the 1930s, basically, important segments have lost faith that this cooperative imperial diplomacy will last, right, and will work. So what they basically do is they turn to more hard power solutions, right? Military solutions. And the army is no longer willing to, in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army, which is one of their sort of imperial expeditionary armies in northeast China, they were no longer willing to wait and watch Japan's interest. They believed that it was no longer possible to maintain Japan's position in China without resorting to military force.
So it was sort of preemptive self-defense.
It was preemptive self-defense, right? We know where, it's like, it goes. It's a great leap into the empire's borders expand. And then so after that, Japan commits itself to building up a state in Manchuria, establishing this new Imperial Manchuria. And as a consequence of that, they leave the League of Nations. Their policy after that moves from this kind of, League of Nations, Washington system, cooperative imperialism, to a more regionalist sort of building up of a kind of geopolitical bloc. This isn't just Japan doing this. At the same time, in the British Empire, which Australia was a part of, we were moving towards imperial preference and tariffs, right? So most of the world was sort of fragmenting. The global economy had started to fragment into geopolitical blocks. And one of the key lessons of World War I, which was in the mind of many, was what happened to Germany, the Hohenzollern Germany, that if you don't have a big enough natural resource base to sustain yourself throughout a prolonged war, you're not going to survive. So these ideas of the experience of World War I, the breakdown of the international order, sort of coalesced together into Japanese thinking about what was required for the security of the empire.
And, of course, its role in World War II. We won't spend too much time on World War II itself, Andrew. I guess it'd be good to move now to the post-World War II situation in Japan. What was the state of politics in Japan immediately after World War II? I mean, in disarray, no doubt.
It's in disarray. So the American-led occupation begins under the general headquarters and, General MacArthur leading the occupation. And the occupation lasts from 1945 to basically 52. I'm terrible with dates, but it's close enough. But during this period, the Japanese political parties, have been out of power since 1932, right? They've maintained, a strong power base within the parliament, but they've never, regained control of the cabinet chambers. So the parties start reforming. Different groups from the great former wartime parties, the Minseito and the Seiyukai, start to reform in different organizations. The Japan Communist Party, which is no longer banned and outlawed, revives and becomes a major political force in that period. And the socialists also. But the socialists are divided. There's a right-wing socialist party and a left-wing socialist party. And the divisions in there trace themselves back to the politics of the wartime years. During this time, parties are falling from power based on corruption. There's, changes in government until, basically Yoshida Shigeru, a former diplomatist, takes the reins of the premiership and, brings kind of stability to Japanese politics from the late 40s onwards into the mid 50s. During this time, Kishi himself, so he had opposed the end of the war. And, after he'd helped bring down the Tojo government in 1944, he attempted to get into parliament, but it never worked. So he formed his own political faction, which was resolutely opposed to ending the war. They believed that the war could still be won. And even until the very end of the war, they were attempting to bring about a military intervention, the overthrow of the government. And even after the atomic bombings of the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they still refused to surrender. So Kishi was part of this group, and he was arrested soon after the end of the war by the American forces. As you know, I found in the archives, the exact quote is, he was arrested as a threat to the revival of democratic tendencies. He's moved to Sugamo prison as a suspected Class A war criminal, and he's held there from basically 1945 through to about 1948. So he's in prison for a while, and he's interrogated a lot by the Americans. But during this period, there's a shift in American policy, the so-called reverse course, where the United States moves away from the democratization, because they're fearing, the empowerment of the Japanese Communist Party, massive union demonstrations. They could be a revolutionary situation developing. So the Americans move away from that, and with the intensification of the Cold War in Europe, and towards building up Japan as a bastion of American geopolitical power in Asia, which, at that period was in utter tumult, with the civil war in China and the steady, loss of the nationalist government there. So for the Americans, someone like Kishi looked like a good bet. He's a technocrat. He was renowned as an anti-communist. He was someone who was able to, had wide connections in the bureaucracy, in business and other places. And he was someone who was willing to deal. Right. And, there's many reasons why, Kishi walks out of Sugamo prison on basically, I think it's Christmas Eve. And it's just the day after General Tojo and most of the Class A war criminals are hanged. And the question is, how he got out of that, which is, an interesting story. When you read the interrogation reports, it's interesting how Kishi was able to make himself seem useful. Right. And how a man like that could become useful to the United States, as we go forward. It's there's a lot still there that we don't have access to. One of the ways, because the files are still classified, one of the things I got access to was Kishi's diary when he was in prison, and that sort of gives us a sort of day-to-day look at his life in the prison, but also, how he was negotiating with the Americans to get out of there. So Kishi's released and he's depurged, and around 52 he comes back to conservative politics, which is in, completely divided and in disarray. People are disagreeing, parties are formed around personalities. There's division over policy. There's division over the new constitution that's in Japan, the relationship with the United States. There's thousands of war criminals who are the people who are still imprisoned as prisoners of war, war criminals. So there's fundamental questions about Japanese sovereignty. Okinawa is occupied by the United States. 500,000 Japanese soldiers are imprisoned in Siberia. There's fundamental questions about how Japan returns. And Kishi comes into this period. At first, he eschews, he doesn't join the conservative parties. He flirts with the socialists, actually.
Well, it's not surprising in a way, because he was certainly interested in the state controlling the economy, that the economy should serve the interests of the state rather than of individual owners of capital. So, a lot of those concepts would resonate very closely with socialist ideals.
Yeah, they did. And the interesting thing is, the left part of the Socialist Party, they sort of boycotted his entry. They said, look, he might speak like this, but his aim is not socialist aims. His aim is, the restoration of state power. By that time, Kishi had developed, pretty deep connections, with business and that. So his first attempt to return to politics occurs. He establishes something called the Japan Reconstruction Federation, which is funded by munitions corporations. And the idea was that munitions should remain a key part of the Japanese economic revival. And this party was a vision of a transcending politics, standing above politics, a kind of transcendentalism, that they will stand above sectional and party and personal and partisan interests, the tergiversations of the parties, and, act in the name of the national interest. And it's interesting when you look at his electoral campaign, he presents himself as a wartime leader, one of those people who took the decisions necessary for Japan to succeed. He's defeated, his first attempt to return to politics defeated, and that's when he joins the Conservative Party. But the moment he enters into the Liberal party under Yoshida Shigeru. He starts a white ant, his premiership. Automatic, everything from the backbenchers, he's white anting him. He's establishing, an office with, this sort of war office in one of the hotels just near the parliament. They're producing reams of, pamphlets undermining Yoshida at every turn, creating factional groupings, arguing for the dissolution of the party and the creation of a larger conservative party. So basically, from the time he enters parliament in around 52 until 55, his main aim is the reorganization of conservative politics and the creation of a stable governing conservative hegemony, which he succeeds.
And what is his overarching vision then? Because he's obviously railed against capitalism in the 30s, doesn't see himself post-war as a socialist, despite socialists railing against capitalism. His conservative tendencies, are they about restoring Japan's pride and prestige?
He believes that Japan has to restore a kind of, that international politics is like, kind of Hobbesian realm of the survival of the fittest sort of thing, where states devour one another. And his idea is Japan has to restore its military and economic strength. And he's disturbed by, Japan's so-called subservience to the United States in the American imposed constitution, which was written by the United States, imposed on Japan. And for Kishi, that's one of the key, points of the malaise. His problems weren't about just military power or the role of the emperor. It was more about this kind of a spiritual rejuvenation, that without a constitution written by the Japanese people, and that came from their own historical experience, the country itself weakened their sense of nation and their, patriotism kind of thing.
What was his attitude towards America in the early 50s then, Andrew?
Yeah, he'd been hostile to the United States throughout most of his career. His first trip to the United States...
Certainly during the 40s.
During the 40s, yeah. I mean, for the first period, when he visited the United States in the early 30s for the first time, he spoke of seeing this vast nation, the vast economic power and, with a kind of antipathy towards it. And that antipathy only grew. Throughout the 1930s, he was on the side of those who argued for an alliance with Germany and then the Axis Pact and then...
And Andrew, was that because he saw the United States as emblematic of capitalism or a threat to Japanese power and interest? Why did he have a sort of an automatic antipathy to the United States in the 30s?
A lot of that, I think, has to do with, from his youth, he'd been opposed to these ideas like of Wilsonianism, liberalism. He saw them as antithetical to the direction Japan wanted.
So too much focused on the individual and individual rights and freedoms and not enough of a focus on the power of the state.
Power of the state. And he also saw the United States potentially as a danger to Japan's empire and in the long term. And, his sympathy was for Germany. Was for the idea of this high culture, this Teutonic vision, because he studied, a bit and he spent time in Berlin. And he saw Germany, Japan, and as kind of proletarian states in the international system who had not been given these vast spoils, of the colonial holdings of the other states.
Had earned it.
They hadn't got it yet, right? They came along too late. They were late earners. They were late, late developers. And it came from there. And it was also the United States, there was issues with the United States over the racial barring of Japanese immigrants. There was issues with the United States over, these arms limitations treaties, which imposed upon Japan a kind of progressive arms limitation where Japan had the lowest level of ships, then the UK, then the US in Asia, right? So there was deep distaste. And there was also a fundamental distaste of parliamentary democracy for Kishi. And because he'd seen it collapse and he equated the Anglo-American powers with a kind of liberalism that, seemed to him antithetical to what was required of Japan. And at that time, they sort of saw the experiments going on in the Soviet Union and in Germany as the wave of the future. That liberal ideas had reached, an impasse or an end. And now these new ideas of state-controlled discipline, militarization were, the waves of the future. So he made a choice, right? His choice was that the fundamental structure of international politics required renovation, that the established order could no longer hold, and there needed to be a transformation of international politics and a redistribution of land, territories, power, and a new system of politics, of international politics developing. It was a sweeping vision of domestic renovation, domestic transformation. coupled with international renovation on a scale that in the Second World War we saw the outcome of that.
Oh, of course. But I mean, in the post-war era, we've had 6 years of American occupation of Japan. Kishi is becoming once again very politically active and then undermining his party leader in Yoshida and white-handing. But he is instrumental in the formation of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is still the leading political party in Japan to this day, and let alone the leading centre-right party. It is the party of government. There's been sort of blips in its post-war history of other parties being in government, but it really is just blips we're talking about. But do you see Kishi as a sort of Menzies-like figure in terms of formation of the leading party of the centre-right and I guess the leading figure in post-war Japan?
Yeah, I would say so. Look, I mean, there were two leading figures, right? Two figures who I think, were there. There was Yoshida Shigeru, the diplomat. But if you're thinking about the formation of the centre-right party, the Liberal Democratic Party in 1955, which merged the traditions of party government from the pre-war with the kind of mobilization politics of the wartime, the attempt was to create a governing party. Because when they formed the LDP, you have to think about it's 10 years after the end of the war, right? And for people like Kishi, they were haunted by the chaos that underfell the empire, right? The parties that fell from power, the bloodletting, the bloodshed, the attempted military revolutions, and then the period of the wartime politics with the mobilization era from 39 to 40, basically 40 to 45, the wartime years. So when they formed this party, they were haunted by the chaos of the past, and they set about attempting to forge a kind of conservative party which would bring stability to Japan. And in that way they did, right?
And in this phase, of course, Kishi is now accepting of the US imposed constitution and this sort of parliamentary democratic system with obviously the associated rights and freedoms that came with it. So how did he make that leap from his attitudes of the 30s and 40s to 1950s leader of a leading party in a parliamentary democratic system?
Constitutional democracy. Yeah, we make these reinventions in our life, right? And Kishi is no exception, I don't think. And there's a great deal of an ability to adapt to circumstance, right? The empire wasn't coming back, right? And the options that they had attempted throughout the 1930s no longer were there. So if you see the creation of the LDP in 1955 as part of an arc of a series of constitutional experimentations, Kishi's views evolved. And they adapted to the circumstances that were there for anyone with political ambition. And he was an ambitious person who had attempted to get into politics from basically, the late 30s onwards. By the 1950s, there was no other option but an acceptance of party government. What his attempt with the LDP was to ameliorate what he saw as some of the weaknesses of liberal democracy, the sort of instabilities, and build it into a kind of long-term conservative hegemonic order. And that hegemonic order, one of the key pillars of that was the alliance with the United States, Japan's long-term security and political alliance with the United States. How Kishi made that jump with the United States? Well, he started early, right? He was often a visitor to the U.S. Embassy, giving inside information, what's going on in Japanese politics, something you might know. Politicians come and talk, or we go and see them.
Was the United States, we're interested in Australia's attitude, of course, to Kishi, but, having seen Kishi in the 30s as a admirer of Germany, of the Soviet Union, was there a sense in the United States that this guy really couldn't be trusted? I mean, he sort of was literally going where the wind blew, and he would change his position based on where he saw his personal interests advantage rather than the national interest or, standing on principle. Because it seems to me that his principles adjusted as society changed, and he didn't seem to have a line in the sand over which he wouldn't cross.
No, I think that's the perfect way to say it, right? He was malleable, right? And he adapted to the circumstance, and I don't think there was a point of principle where he said, well, this far and no further, right? Because everything was negotiable, right? If it served what he saw as potentially, the transcendental national interest, right? And the United States, they weren't under any illusions who this man was. Kishi had started very early, even in prison, to make that transition, right? So in the last months of his prison diary, right, which he'd kept, and which start off as, deeply anti-American. His whole diary, even his post-war memoirs, it begins in 1945, and he never speaks what happened previous to that. He begins his there with a screed against, the American occupation and all that, showing his deep hostility to it. But when he was in prison, he made a choice. He started arguing that Japan should raise a volunteer force of former military, ex-servicemen to serve in a kind of multinational anti-communist army to support the United States in East Asia, to fight against the Chinese communists, and then in Korea later. So he started to make himself useful to the United States, right? And he presented himself as an anti-communist. Well, that itself sort of limits exactly what you were saying, that, an anti-communist. But in 1940, he was forced from government under accusations of being a red. He had to spend 3 months overseas because he was, basically going to be arrested as a communist. They said, his ideas of controlled economy were communistic. So how that man makes that transition in the 50s, it's very opportunistic. And the Americans see that, but they can work with him, right? Because he's someone who, he has the political factions behind him. He has business lining up with him because, his former friends are now running major corporations. And he seems like someone who by this time has turned, in an anti-communist direction, or anti-Soviet direction would probably be the best way to put it. He's someone who can make a deal. And he visits the United States in 1955, just before the creation of the LDP. And in that meeting, he says what the Americans want to hear. He argues for conservative stability, building up of Japanese economic resources, and Japanese taking a greater role in American security in what was then called the Far East. So he was moving strategically, both in terms of getting America's imprimatur and winning control of enough political power within Japan to bring about conservative consolidation. And after that, he hoped his elevation to the premiership.
His relationship with Australia, of course, would have been a secondary consideration for him over the relationship with the United States. But 2 years after his formation of the LDP in 1955, he signs this commerce agreement with Australia, which is a very significant political move on his behalf as well as on Australia's behalf. How did he conceive of Australia, and conversely, how did Australia conceive of Kishi, given all the history?
Yeah, well, in the 30s, right? So late 30s, he's in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And, in 1941, he serves as a wartime architect of the economy. And Australia's economic part of that was huge, right? Even though Australia put sanctions in, like embargoed trade, up until the very end, right up to almost, the Second World War in Asia starts, we're still sending,
pig iron to Japan. Of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Pig Iron Bob is sending pig iron to Japan.
Exactly, yes. Right? So, he had a good sense of that. So by the 1950s, Japan's traditional markets where it's pulled natural resources, whether Korea or Manchuria or China, is closed off, right? That's no longer an option for Japan to get resources from the Soviet Union. There's no longer possible to get resources. And so Japan has to look for new markets. So it's focused its attention on Southeast Asia, but Australia becomes one of the linchpins of that. It is a stable supplier. So for Japan to ensure economic development, and Reconstruction is just starting to hit a new speed where, by the late 50s, we're entering a sort of shadowlands of, the sort of high-speed economy of the 1960s, what they call the miracle economy. Historians should never say miracle because we'll lose our jobs if everything's a miracle. And that's not good. But Australia is key to this, right? So the Treaty of Commerce becomes a key linchpin in Japan's return to international politics, its return to Asia, and the building of what's a kind of transnational infrastructure for the Japanese economic development, a stable basis upon which, to power Japan's new, economic revival throughout the 50s and into the 60s and 70s and onwards to the present.
What was the attitude in Australia, do you think, towards Kishi? Australia supports Japan's entry into the Colombo Plan, its admission into the United Nations, even its election to the Security Council. It's one of the first allied nations to normalise its trade relations with Japan following World War II, which sets a precedent which other nations would follow. Australia is pretty forward-leaning when it comes to Japan, despite its wartime experience as an aggressor state.
Yeah, this surprises me, right, when you really think about it, because as you sort of alluded to earlier with your own family's history, the feelings were raw. right? I mean, it's hard to remember how raw these feelings were. Just, we're talking, less than a decade after the end of the war, after a lot of these men, Australian servicemen, after the fall of Singapore, had been imprisoned in some incredibly, brutal conditions. I mean, you can't hide or you can't downplay the brutality of those periods. It was rough. And, for these same people who then go into government to put aside their own, years of captivity in terms of and become forward-leaning for the Australia-Japan relationship, that's something, right? It's something we really have to grapple with about, how people can not, bring their own experiences, but at the same time think, in terms of larger questions of national interest and strategic priority. So that was quite forward-leaning. This Treaty of Commerce becomes, a symbol of that in 1957. That treaty serves as the basis upon which the relationship, begins. But it came through the teeth of, real opposition. You had to have a strong leader at that time, right? A strong prime minister and cabinet and party, which were able to push through those policies. Because nowadays we don't think about the RSL as a really powerful political force, but they were powerful, right? Up until, I remember even growing up, in Victoria, we had really prominent RSL figures were on television, the head of the RSL, right? And
Bruce Ruxton,
that's it, right? These were prominent figures. And if they were prominent figures back then, they were even more so in the 1950s, right? The RSL was powerful. And there was a deep antipathy to Kishi's visit. I mean, it's not simply that he's the leader of Japan, the former wartime enemy and the captivity. This was the architects of the wartime economy who had ministerial responsibility for the mines, for some of the, the labor camps and all that. So Kishi comes with a huge baggage when he arrives in Australia. His post-war memoirs are repellent. When he talks about his time in Australia, he says that, this visit to Australia comes on the back of a historic visit throughout Asia, where he goes to the Philippines, he goes to Taiwan, India, throughout most of Southeast Asia. And so it comes at the back of that sort of trip. And he says it's the hardest trip he had to make, right?
Is he having to express contrition, or is it a very forward-looking trip in terms of the messaging that the Menzies government is making around welcoming him? And, I mean, he goes to the War Memorial in Canberra and lays a wreath, which would have been a pretty difficult moment, the photograph, seeing that back in Japan. How does the Japanese public view that? How does the Australian public view that? It must have been, for the Mandarins and I guess the media advisors and the like around the political class, it must have been very difficult messaging to handle.
It would have been very difficult, right? So I know that. So in the National Library, when I was a fellow at the National Library of Australia, I found there, so they had collected all these documents the Japanese embassy here in Australia had printed up just before the arrival of Kishi, and that's talking about the relationship with the Menzies government and Kishi, and introducing Kishi to the Australian political classes, and they're fascinating documents. I mean, they must have been printing up, day and night in the Japanese embassy. It would have been an interesting thing to have been there, but they're trying their best to, Kishi is like a defender of constitutional government, constitutional state. They want to build a strong new relationship with Australia. They hark back to Japan's role in transporting Australian soldiers to Gallipoli in the First World War and all that. And so they were trying to say, look, this schism in relationships in the war years was an incredibly regrettable moment, right? But they were trying to emphasize that is a blip in a kind of longer arc of, relationships between the two countries that arc back, even to the 19th century. And that. So there was an attempt to say, look, this is where the relationship is. Now, Kishi going to the War Memorial, that was a hard thing for him to do. The moment he stepped off the plane in Sydney, he said it was rough. People were not happy. He said the tension was palpable in the air. You could cut it with a knife, basically, if you read between the lines. But the aim is, and the knowledge within Japan is very clear. This relationship is central. And the fact that the Menzies government is created this space, Kishi was going to take it because he needed it. Right? And they knew that long-term this relationship would be central to acquire the mineral resources necessary for Japan's return to power. And there's another point here too. So, for the Japanese, they were deeply grateful for Australia's support for Japan's entry into the UNO, the United Nations Organization. And because the UN was one of the key pillars of Japanese diplomacy. And we forget how important the UN is, right? I mean, sometimes these days it's not really taken seriously, but in the 50s, it was a key pillar of diplomacy and a key pillar of how the Japanese viewed their role in the world. So Australia's support, the Menzies government support, would have been deeply appreciated, I think, in the halls of power in Tokyo.
Well, it's interesting that 10 years later, in 1967, Japan had already surpassed the UK as the largest importer of Australian goods. So, it shows that rapid transformation in Australia's trading relations from one being very much UK Commonwealth focused with the preference arrangement with Commonwealth countries to one which is becoming very much focused on Asia by that stage.
That's such an interesting point. So Australia and Japan are both, Australia's this reluctant de-imperializing state, right? Australia really didn't want the British Empire and, the sort of Commonwealth to sort of end. And at the same time, Japan is this outlier in Asia, a former empire, and both states are kind of like the orphans of Asia in some ways, right? And both states have a strategic interest in watching what is happening with the British withdrawal. The British withdrawal eventually behind Suez, but the British sort of pull back. And their relationship develops in the context of the steady withdrawal of British power. And so there's an interesting interlay where Australia is reluctantly de-imperializing and, moving away from this British world that had been so integral to its identity. And Japan becomes a partner in that process, which I think that is really interesting when you think of the Menzies government, their commitment to the British world, but also their understanding that they need to develop a kind of architecture that will allow Australia to sort of move beyond that.
Yeah, and adapt to the changing realities. So, the alliance with the United States, of course, but trade with Japan and with Asia more broadly. The legacy Kishi leaves Japan, is great. It's obvious that the creation of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which, as I was saying before, is pretty much the party of government in Japan, is fundamental. His grandson, of course, is Shinzo Abe, who becomes Prime Minister on 2 occasions and, of course, is tragically assassinated just a few years ago. But, that is also another political legacy of Kishi's. How big is the impact of Kishi to modern-day Japanese? Does he loom large in their memory and in his contributions to the creation of modern Japan?
I think they have a really complex relationship to Kishi. So from around the 1970s, his legacy starts to come under attack. So after he was forced from power in 1960 with this huge, the largest demonstrations in modern Japanese history against the revision of the security treaty with the United States, Kishi remains in parliament for another 20 years, basically as sort of like an ex-prime minister in the parliament with huge power and influence over politics in there. But his legacy leaves a complex one. The Japanese mostly remember him as a suspected Class A war criminal. His role in the wartime empire and the wartime tragedy, the end of the disintegration, destruction of the Japanese empire, and the LDP. But his legacy is entwined and complex because it entwines with Cold War, the Cold War international politics and his grandson's legacy. And one of the great ironies was the political murder of Abe Shinzo. He's murdered by a former adherent or a son of an adherent of the Unification Church of Korea. And Kishi was one of the key architects of that relationship where he built, relationship with these Korean and, new religions, which provided, kind of mobilization at election time and then support, financing for Japanese political candidates. He was one of the key architects of those Cold War alliances between the Japanese conservatives and, Korean churches and other things. In a great irony, those Cold War ghosts become, sort of reach out and claim the life of his grandson. And in many ways, the death of Shinzo Abe marks a sort of culmination of this period of Kishi politics. And Kishi's power was, throughout the Cold War was immense. His brother, Sato Eisaku, was the former longest-serving premier of Japan, only to be, succeeded by his grandson. So the families had an immense impact over the course and development of Japanese politics. But the legacy he leaves for the people in Japan is quite complex. And I don't think it's been fully dealt with. There hasn't been enough reckoning with this. And the problem is there hasn't been many books written on this issue in Japanese. When I first started to work on this question at Kyoto University, my Japanese professor said, this is going to be a tough one. I don't know if it's a great idea.
Too difficult.
Too difficult. Maybe you could come up with...
Let bygones be bygones.
Exactly. Yeah. Come back with something else than that. But I persisted and convinced him. But through this life, what we're seeing is the arc of Japan's transformation across this 20th century. And the legacy he leaves is ambivalent, right? Great political and institutional successes, one of the architects of so much of Japan's development, but also implicated in so many of its great, in the destruction of its empire and, the calamity and cataclysm of World War II.
But I think you would say that while he was incredibly flexible in his political views and strategy, in the end, his overriding ambition was for Japan's national interest as he perceived it.
Yeah, completely, yeah. I mean, it's a difference between tactics and, strategy, right? You make tactical maneuvers in the service of a long-term goal. And the long-term goal for Kishi was, quite clear. It was what he called the revision of the post-war order, the overcoming of the post-war, revision of the United States imposed constitution, greater equality in Japan's relationship, a more independent Japan, a restoration of Japan as a great power in international politics, and also a political system geared towards the development of national wealth and national power. In later life, his focus was on these issues. And the legacy he leaves in terms of the conservative hegemony in Japan, a state that is still one of the great economic powers, and in terms of Australia and Japan, his legacy is huge. The legacy of Menzies and Kishi in this. We're coming up next year on the 50th anniversary of the Nara Treaty, the Treaty of Friendship, which creates the fundamental basis for this more than an economic relationship, the political, strategic relationship. And it became, Japan and Australia was central to things like, APEC and other sort of larger initiatives. So the legacies of this moment in 1957, that really hard visit, the political decisions of the Menzies government at that time to invite Kishi, which would not have been popular by any measure on the, in left or right of conservative politics, left or right in politics. There was a lot of opposition on the left to this too. So this was hard politics at the time, right?
Well, as you say, quite an extraordinary legacy, a complicated one. And Andrew Levidis, thank you so much for bringing this story to us here on Afternoon Light.
Thank you so much for having me here.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.